week 4 of the trial of Alec Murdaugh began with all new video being made public. You're seeing part of it here. This is a look at that body cam video from the night of the killings, where Maggie and Paul Murdaugh were killed there on the family's Colleton County property back in 2019. Now you can see here Alec is interacting with the deputy who was first to arrive on scene. Alec is telling the deputy that he had grabbed a gun for safety and he was leaning against a truck. He also mentioned to the deputy that the family had received threats, specifically his son Paul, after a deadly boat crash in 2019. Now both Maggie and her son Paul were, again, as we mentioned, found brutally shot to death there on that property. Now Alec has been charged with their murders. Now, a big focus in court today was testimony on autopsies. Fox County's Grace Runkle breaks down what happened in Walterboro.
The images from Maggie and Paul Murdaugh's autopsies are sealed. Only members of the jury will be looking at those, but we still all heard some very graphic, gruesome testimony from the pathologist who performed their autopsies. Pathologist Dr. Ellen Reamer went wound by wound, explaining to the jury what Maggie and Paul's last moments would have been like. Maggie suffered multiple gunshot wounds. The first 3 were not fatal, but one of those shots, Reamer says, hit Maggie's abdomen and one of her kidneys, putting her in extreme pain. Reamer theorizes Maggie was then bent over, clutching her stomach when she says the fatal shot was fired through her chest, into her jaw, and then her brain. Paul's wounds were just as catastrophic, with Reamer even acknowledging, almost apologizing for how horrible the images were.
What happened here was an extremely severe, immediately fatal injury, because what it did was that after it went through the left side of the neck and face, our brain is basically held up through the skull, so we have bone at the top of the skull, but then we also have a bone that kind of holds up the brain. It went through the base of the skull, okay, which is kind of like in this area, the brain is up there, and this wound, actually, his brain was ejected out of the top of the right side of his head and actually arrived at the autopsy in a separate bucket.
Reamer also says Paul would have been looking in the direction of the shooter when that fatal shot was fired. And throughout all of the pathologist's testimony, Alec Murdaugh was very distressed. He was the most emotional that we've seen so far, rocking back and forth, truly looking almost disgusted at times, having to listen to the details of the conditions that Maggie and Paul's bodies were in when they finally made their way to the pathologist. In Walterboro, Grace Runkle, Fox Carolina News.
Now the testimony focused on how Murdaugh's wife Maggie was acting in the days before she and their son Paul were shot and killed at the family's hunting property in Colleton County.